Good evening. I would like to thank N. Jarman from Friends of Edith, who has asked me if I could speak about Gytha, King Harold's elder daughter, her adventures after the Battle of Hastings, and how she ended up in medieval Kyiv, married into a Rus princely family. Gytha's story represents an historical connection between England and Kyiv, as well as a common medieval history owned by Russia and Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine didn't exist as a country then, and neither did Russia. These were the lands of the Rus, who had a shared Viking and Slav heritage. So can you imagine what young Gytha's adventures must have been like? No telegraph, no rail maps as we know them, and certainly no sat-nav. Journeys by sea and along great rivers such as the Dnieper and the Volga, and on roads that were mere tracks through forests. Gytha was, we believe, dwelling with her grandmother, Countess Gytha, and other noble Saxon women in the Saxon palace of Exeter following the Norman conquest. The Countess appears to have been involved in resistance to Norman taxation in the southwest. King William, determined to stamp out all resistance, rode south with a great army and besieged Exeter for 3 weeks during the harsh winter of 1068. Exeter capitulated, and King William allowed Countess Gytha and the Saxon noble ladies to depart into exile, apparently with a great treasure. The citizens of Exeter were not penalised because King William required complete submission and the payment of his tax. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records what happened to Countess Gytha and the other women. The Countess, of course, was Gytha's grandmother. And here, Gytha, mother of Harold, travelled away to the island of Flatholm, and the wives of many good men with her, and lived for a certain time, and so went across the sea to Saint-Omer. This is from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Countess Gytha and her youngest daughter, Gunhild, and her granddaughter, Princess Gytha, sailed across the seas to Saint-Omer in Flanders with the noble women and the huge treasure that she had assembled. Flanders for the Countess and the noble ladies may indeed have been their final destination. Ulrich Vitalis, a Norman Anglo cleric writing in the first half of the 12th century, tells us what happened next. He said that from Ireland, Harold's sons went to Flanders to join Countess Gytha in fruitless exile, but they were to play no part in future risings which involved the Danes in England. So what really happened next? Was Flanders the final exile for Gytha? No, according to the northern sources, 2 sons and a daughter of Harold, Princess Gytha, took refuge in Denmark with their cousin Sven Ethelstan, King of Denmark. Nothing much is heard of the brothers, but in 1075, Gytha was given in marriage by Sweyn to Vladimir Monarch, a prince of the Rus. She had lived at the court of King Sweyn for 5 years and would now have been aged around 20. Gytha probably did have a generous dowry to take with her, perhaps some of her grandmother's treasure. After all, her grandmother was Danish, and she was King Sweyn's aunt. Sweyn was a canny medieval Christianised Viking who looked very fierce and walked with a limp. He did not miss a trick. And so, across the Baltic, sailed Gytha to her wedding in Novgorod in northwest Russia. At the time, Rus territories comprised much of which is western Russia and Ukraine. To the east lived powerful, wealthy nomad steppe tribes ruled by Khans, and they were a persistent threat. So why did Gytha marry into the Rus royal family known as the Rurikid dynasty? Well, there had been long-standing connections between Scandinavian lands and Rus lands through a common Viking heritage and through marriages. Gytha's was not the first of these marriages. The Rurik dynasty, rulers of the Rus lands, were of Viking origin. Connections with Scandinavia were there already. The Rus controlled trade from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Presumably Sweyn did very well out of the marriage with trading concessions. And the Rus were outrageously wealthy from trade with various ruling vast principalities and trade with the Black Sea territories. They owned lands which comprised Novgorod, Chernikov, Peroslavl, Kyiv and Rostock. And importantly, they controlled the great rivers of the Dnieper and the Volga from Novgorod in the north as far as the Black Sea in the south. Gytha married Prince Vladimir, so-called Vladimir Mamonok, because his mother was Greek. He was at this time governor of Chernikov, just north of Kyiv. He was of a similar age to Gytha. She was called Gytha by the Rus. Vladimir was an eldest son, handsome, and a warrior. His father was soon to take over from Vladimir's uncle as Grand Prince of all the Rus lands and as chief amongst Rus princes. Gytha, or Anglo-Saxon princess, would become Princess of Peroslavl, the principality most dangerously situated southeast of Kyiv, very close to lands belonging to nasty warrior steppelands tribes. After her marriage, Gytha travelled with Vladimir to Kyiv to meet her new relatives, the exceptionally affluent cousins of her new aristocratic family, before settling down to married life. She, of course, was used to warriors in her family. After all, she had 3 warrior uncles who died in 1066, as well as her father, King Harold. What was she getting into? Well, the Rurik dynasty ruled Rus since the 9th century, and, as I said, they were of Viking and Slav origin. Vladimir's great-grandfather, the first Vladimir, was the most famous of these princes. He introduced Christianity into Rus lands. A story in the Russian Chronicle goes that in search for a religion to unify his people, Vladimir I investigated, first of all, the Muslim religion, but disregarded it because the Muslim people did not drink alcoholic beverages. The Jewish religion did not appeal because Vladimir could not understand why their God had allowed them to be deprived of their lands. He settled on the Orthodox Christianity rather than Catholicism because he preferred Orthodox rituals and was impressed by the magnificence of the Church of Santa Sophia in Constantinople. There are frescoes in St. Sophia, Kyiv, showing the Rurikid princes and others belonging to the 11th century ruling family. Most of them, especially women, remain unnamed, so it is hard to identify who is who and if one is possibly Gytha herself. Kyiv in the 11th century was built with palaces and fortifications intertwined with natural ravines on the west bank of the Dnieper River. By 1050, Kyiv had 40 churches, 8 marketplaces. It was thriving. The vision perceived by townsmen, visitors entering the city and even invading nomads if they looked upwards from the banks of the Dnieper River, must have been awe-inspiring. You enter medieval Kyiv through the splendour of the Golden Gate, which was built back in 1035 by Gytha's husband's grandfather, Prince Yaroslav. This same grandfather built the 2 stately cathedrals dedicated to Santa Sophia, modelled on Santa Sophia in present-day Istanbul, which was then Constantinople. One was in Novgorod and the other in Kyiv. From the Golden Gate, Gytha would have entered a large square with palaces and the beautiful Cathedral of St. Sophia. It must have been a breathtaking sight for this newlywed young woman who still had to master a new language and a Cyrillic script. She adopted the Orthodox faith, managed her household and visited nunneries. The era was known as Kyiv's Golden Age. Princes provided protection, Orthodox priests spiritual guidance. St. Sophia was large and richly decorated with mosaics and frescoes, marble pillars. The church possessed 2 additional apses to the standard 3, 2 tower staircases, and a crown of 13 cupolas which rise higher and higher to a peak that seemingly stretches heavenwards. The cathedral came to symbolise orthodoxy for the Kievan Rus, and by the time Gytha had come to Kyiv, the city was already the jewel in the Orthodox crown in the Orthodox world, rivaling Constantinople itself. To some extent, her life was very sheltered because women lived in what was known as a tarim. Rus princes were monogamous, so this was not to be confused with a harem. Rather, the tarim would have comprised the luxurious women and children's apartments separate from male areas. And apart from special occasions, they would have dined separately. Since her husband was governor of Chernikov at the time of their marriage, Gytha was the most important woman in the tarim of Chernikov, and of course she commanded all domestic arrangements. However, they were terrifying times too. Tribes from the steppe lands attacked Rus cities. During her lifetime, she saw deadly power struggles, a little bit like our own Wars of the Roses, emerge between her husband, his father, and their cousins. Battles between cousins and conflicts were not resolved until 1097. Gytha and Vladimir, during this time, had 3 sons and a daughter. In her lifetime, the Russian primary chronicle was written within Kievan monasteries. It's the earliest Russian history book and is also known as Tales of Bygone Days. It is important because it shows how diverse regions have a common culture and a standardised shared history. No matter how widely branches of the Kievan Rus spread apart, they did grow from common roots. The Kyiv that Gytha knew rivaled the populations, say, the size of London or Paris, and the city's wealth was reflected in its art, architecture, craft and commerce. She would have entertained travellers and crusaders travelling east. She must have known the many immigrant communities, especially Anglo-Saxons who settled in Kyiv after 1066. Her brothers may have ended up in Kyiv too. And then Vladimir became the Grand Prince of the Rus following his father's death in 1113. But sadly, by this time, Gytha had died. She entered a nunnery at the end of her life. She may have sickened, we just don't know. Mstislav, the eldest son of Gytha and Vladimir, was known as Harold in memory of her father, which I think is a really nice touch. Mstislav Harold became Grand Prince of Kyiv following his father's death. His descendants include Philippa of Hainault, who married Edward III, and therefore one can say that King Harold's dynasty and descendants of Edith Swanneck returned to England. I like to think that her life in the lands of the Rus was a happy one, and that Gytha's marriage to her Rus prince was a great success. He was, by all accounts, a highly educated and thoughtful prince, and she, like other Godwin women, was educated to a high standard in Wilton Abbey. She is possibly buried inside the church along with other members of her family. And so, through their daughter Gytha, Edith Swanneck and King Harold sowed a long-lasting legacy. Gytha is not remembered today. She is never mentioned on a school curriculum, and like many historical women, she ought to be rescued from history's shadows. She was a great princess, an ambassadress to early Ukraine and Russia, the wife of a strong, admired prince, the mother of princes, and an ancestress of her own royalty. Gytha of the Rus, daughter of Edith Swanneck, was indeed our first known female ambassador to what is now Russia and Ukraine. Women do get forgotten by history. Their dates of birth and deaths are frequently unrecorded. So, I would like to think that our Anglo-Saxon princess is not forever cast into history's shadowy corners.